We need challenges. We need them in order to grow and in order to figure out new solutions and find new ways and tap into our network of support and, develop those relationships. We need those kind of challenge stresses, but they don't diminish us afterwards. And I think that's the key here when it comes to trauma.
Hello, and welcome to How to Be a Terrible Daughter, the podcast where my cousin and I hate your parents for you, so you don't have to if you're feeling ambivalent about it. So we're going to joke around about our horrible childhoods, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we survived them and just share with each other and you guys the things that we've learned and the things that's helped us. So who are we?
Who are we? Who are we?
Who am I?
Such an existential question. I'm Megan Caper. I'm a medical intuitive and a healer, as well as an occupational therapist. And I survived a horrible childhood. I survived a narcissistic mother. And through that process, developed a lot of tools and healthy coping mechanisms and ways of thinking about things and approaching things that were maybe a little different from the norm. So I have a lot of personal insight about this, as well as professional insight about this, because now I primarily work with people who've had complex trauma and have complicated health issues from their messed up childhoods, among other things.
And I'm Elizabeth Malamud. I'm an artist and a therapist, and who also grew up in the same family system as Megan, which is great because, survivors of narcissistic abuse somehow need to be the ones who bring receipts about their own trauma, as opposed to the narcissists. Okay. So who maintain their innocence. Anyway, so I'm a psychotherapist, and I also have done my own work in healing, and I trained in somatic therapy. One of my specialties is working with people who have personality disorders and people who have those people in their lives. So I'm coming at it from both sides.
Yeah. I love what you said about the survivors need to bring the receipts. And I think that's, one of the reasons I think that this podcast is going to be helpful for people is that, I've found that in my life, I seem to have befriended a lot of people who had narcissistic or other mental health disorders, family of origin. And I think there's a reason for that. There's sort of a anti-gaslighting effect when you get together with people who've experienced something similar, because it's so hard to understand if you haven't experienced it. And I think for you and I, we're so lucky because not only did we both go through it, but we saw each other's mothers growing up. And so not only do I just validate your experience by saying I believe you, right? Which is huge for people who've survived narcissistic abuse. But yeah. I can say, I believe you. And I saw that shit firsthand. So yes. I know you're right. So even if you're doubting yourself or I'm doubting myself, the other person can be like, no, you are fine. You are sane. I saw that. And that was crazy, right?
Yeah.
So.
And then there's this other thing that you didn't see, but I saw.
Yes.
That puts even a whole nother spin on the, crazy parade. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think it's great that we have that for each other. I know that's really rare. Well, maybe it's not so rare. Actually, these things run in families, but I still feel lucky that I had you and still have you as a person to validate my reality and help me through this. So what is this podcast and why do we call it How to Be a Terrible Daughter? And when I've been telling people about this, I've gotten such a 50-50 split. The people who have had parents or family members who've been narcissists, when I tell them the name of the podcast, they start howling in laughter. They totally get it.
Yeah.
And then the other half of people are like, well, yeah, I mean, I was kind of a rebel in high school. I'm like, yeah, no, that's not what this is about at all.
No, this is not like you snuck out one time. You know what I mean?
Right. And got in an appropriate amount of trouble for it.
Yeah.
So, how to be a terrible daughter? I mean, the reason we called it that is because this is for people who, throughout their childhoods were called terrible daughters, horrible daughters, monsters. I got worse. I got things that were a little less PG, but people who were repeatedly, experience that type of degradation and that type of emotional abuse. And now we like to joke about it because you got to either laugh or cry, right? So, this podcast is really just a discussion of all of the effects of narcissistic trauma. As I said before, it's a place where the two of us, people who like both survived this and like really, really care about each other deeply, can talk about what happened to us and share the tools and the strategies that we now use on a daily basis. And it's also for anyone who grew up in a toxic environment and were hurt by the people that were supposed to care for them.
Yeah.
I'm looking at our show notes for the next line and I'm laughing because this actually happened to me this week. So I'm going to share a story. So the next thing I wrote down to read to you guys was anyone who has had a therapist go wide-eyed or slack-jawed during an initial intake session. And I started up with a new therapist last Sunday. Woohoo, shout out to my new therapist. And we were doing the intake, right? Like, she's asking me all sorts of questions about my history and my family and all of that. And at one point I said something where her mouth literally dropped open.
Yeah.
And I started laughing because I was like, oh my God, I have just recently made this joke with someone that in the initial session with every therapist I go to, there is a moment where their mouth drops wide open about something that I say. So if you've ever had that happen to you as well, this podcast is probably for you.
It's a blue ribbon moment.
Yep, I win. I have won at therapy. I shocked a seasoned therapist.
Seriously. Yep. I can't help but share the story. So I was doing a family map with this was years ago. And so she's asking me this question. So she's writing it down and she's just looking at this map and there's just this pause. And to herself, right? She's not even saying this to me. She's looking at it and she goes, "This is fascinating." I'm like, "Oh shit, that's a bad sign."
Yeah.
Fascinating? Like, no.
Yeah, totally.
Many, many years of therapy. I wonder if I can help this person. So,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So if that's you, if you've had therapists mutter under their breath about you in a way of exclaiming fascination, or if you've had them go slack-jawed or wide-eyed, this is also for anyone who's curious about their own childhood and curious about, I'll guess sort of say what is normal, right? Like, was this abnormal? Because I think this is actually a big part of narcissistic trauma, which we're going to talk about today, is wondering, like, was that really abusive or was that normal? Like, how bad was that? So if you're having those thoughts and you're just sort of more curious to get more information or get more examples of what narcissistic abuse looks like, then this podcast is also for you.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I really appreciate about it is that, we both come at it from a personal experience and a professional experience. Because I know, like for me as a therapist, I was trained to sort of be a blank slate. I mean, not like Freudian level blank slate, but to really be very sparing about how much I shared and that it was always in the context of this is what's useful for the other person and all that stuff. And so it's just so great not to keep the secret,
Yeah.
keep the secrets anymore.
Yeah.
So I can use my expertise and I can talk about it. And then I can also just be real and honest about how I came to this level of expertise,
Yeah, totally. What's so interesting is in occupational therapy school, they taught us, OT is generally used for rehab. There's also mental health OT, but usually it's used for what we call FISDIS, physical disabilities. But one of the things we were taught to use as a therapeutic tool was therapeutic use of self. I was struck, coming from a family of therapists, how different it was than the sort of blank slate type of thing I'd heard before. This was really, occupational therapy at its basis is about helping people find meaning in their lives through the activities that they do and the roles they play and the rituals and all of that. And, it was really understood that people aren't going to be able to get deep enough to the place where they can even identify what's meaningful to them unless they feel safe heard and understood, and that really the only way to do that is through the therapeutic use of yourself. It was very
Yeah.
refreshing after having come from a family of multiple therapists and sort of being taught a different way, I will say, for someone to actually say, like, no, like use yourself and your own personality and your own experiences. Obviously use good judgment. This isn't not supposed to trauma dump. However,
Yes.
like, sharing your own experience with going through something is absolutely beneficial for the therapeutic process in occupational therapy. So interesting how different fields have different views on this.
I think yesterday or the day before, I was in therapy, and my therapist shared with me like two like personal things, and they were like these jewels, right? It was like, this person trusts me and respects me enough to just not set aside the work, but just be a person, you
Yeah.
know? So important.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And probably helps to heal years of you feeling or being told you weren't trustworthy, you know?
oh boy. Yeah. Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. Oh, crap. Oh boy. Wow. Okay. Oh, speaking of that, we've talked a little bit about gaslighting, but we haven't done like a full on definition.
Oh,
And
yes.
so the film buff in me, so the term gaslighting comes from an actual movie called Gaslight. I think it's in the 19th century, and Ingrid Bergman plays this beautiful woman who I think is like she's inherited her
Yeah.
aunt's
She's an
estate or whatever.
heiress. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And this guy comes and he just love bombs her and is like, let's be together, blah, blah, blah. But it
Wait,
turns out that,
I'm going to stop you. Can you define love bombing? Because I think that's
oh gosh.
another important term that people may not
Yeah.
completely understand.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay. So love bombing is kind of like how it sounds in that like someone immediately they like fall in love with you and they're like, oh my God, I've searched for you my whole life, or I feel so connected or whatever. And sometimes that includes like buying you gifts or like doing outrageous things like going on adventures together or something like that. But it's like it just feels so good. And it's really a way of taking you in and getting you hooked into to this person so that you're close enough to then get to see the other side of
Yeah.
this person. So is there anything else about that?
No, I think that's great. I think for me, something that I realized at some point is the difference between, because when you first meet someone and you're romantically attracted to them, there is this immediate rush of like, wanting to do romantic things for them and wanting to spend time with them. And so for me, what I came to realize is the difference between like a healthy romantic, I'll even call it a healthy romantic infatuation, because I think there is a phase
Sure.
where we're sort of infatuated with people when we first meet them in a healthy
Yeah.
way. So the difference between that and love bombing is in love bombing, someone puts you up on a pedestal that's way too high for how long and how well they know you. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you're the best person I've ever met. It's like, well, we met a week ago. How well can you know me? Like, how can you say that? Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
Whereas not love bombing would be like, I know I've only known you a week, but like, oh my God, I want to get to know you better. And what I know so far is just amazing. And let's spend more time together so I can get to know you better. Like both of those would feel sort of good to hear. But one of them is like, if you sort of stop and think about it, like the red flag of it is like, wait a minute, how can you be saying these things about me? Like be putting me on such a high pedestal when we've
Yeah.
only known each other a week or a month or whatever it is. So that sort of
Yeah.
helped me to think about the difference.
Yeah, I know for me, like there is this body experience of like it's kind of like hearing a note that's off, right? You're just like, wait a minute, that's hitting me kind of wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And one is I do think that it's really important to cultivate listening to that voice, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I can't help but wonder, well, maybe you tell me, is that the kind of thing that we're kind of born with? And then we get trained out of it and then we have to reinstall it or whatever?
Mm.
Or is it the kind of thing that has really only come to me because I've been burned enough times that it's like,
Yeah,
oh, that's smoke. That's smoke.
that's a good question. I do think that it's a little bit of both, probably. I do think once you've been burned enough times, you like make it a point to learn how to like recognize that inner voice and listen to it because you don't want to be hurt like that again.
Yeah.
But I do think that sort of losing the ability to listen to that voice is part of the like self-abandonment that happens when you're in a relationship with a narcissist. And we can go over
Yeah.
self-abandonment later. I don't want to define too many terms. We're still on gaslighting. I think it's probably a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So gaslighting. So movie from the 1940s, I think, takes place in,
Yeah, that sounds right.
yeah, it takes place in 19th century London. This heiress has been wooed by this man who's a narcissist who love bombs her and just makes her feel like the most amazing woman in the world. Marries her and moves her to London, where she doesn't really know anyone, right? I think that's
Well, I think it's the place where her aunt had her house. And I think it was the place where like she had been as a child, but like
oh,
her aunt's death was kind of traumatic. And so she hadn't been there in a long
got it.
time.
Okay.
But he was
Okay.
like, oh, no, no, no. This is your family home. We must come back. It'll be beautiful and wonderful. Right. Which
Yeah.
is like, oh, yes. Please take me back to the place where I had this terrible trauma and loss. It will be wonderful.
Right. Okay. So then what happens?
Oh, yeah. What happens is that she finds that like when she's alone in the house or something like that, like the lighting starts flickering. And because at the time it wasn't electricity, it was gas.
Mhm.
And so she'd be like, this is so weird. And she'd talk to her husband about it. And he'd be like, what's wrong with you? Like you're going crazy. You're going
Yeah.
crazy.
There was nothing upstairs. She was on the top floor and she kept
No.
hearing thumping, I think.
Oh, she was, I don't, gosh, I don't remember about the exact details of the house, but basically what happens is that like he goes out, but what he really does is he goes to this other part, either up higher or like, in a different part of the house because he's looking for something. He's looking for something. I think he basically killed her aunt and he's like looking for some kind of jewels or money or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And when he goes into these other parts of the house, he turns on the lights and that diverts the gas to the other rooms. And so the gas in her room is flickering. But he spends all of this time just telling her she really believes that she's losing it. And it's just devastating. It's devastating to watch.
Yeah. And I think so gaslighting, I think an important distinction is it's not just lying to someone. I think that term gets thrown around a lot these days. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, I was gaslit. So like if you told me you were going to the store, but you really went to a birthday party or something. I don't know. Like that's not gaslighting. That's just lying, which isn't good in and of itself. But gaslighting contains the component where when you then ask the person about it, they turn around and make you feel like you're crazy for even asking the question. Like your perception of reality is off. And I think that's the really, really important thing to get here is that gaslighting is not just catching someone in a lie or being with someone who's even a habitual liar. That's not gaslighting. Gaslighting is when someone, sometimes even intentionally, will do things to create a result. And then when you go to them and say, this weird thing is happening, why did that happen? Like you said you were going to the store, but I found this receipt for a birthday card. Like, why would you have a birthday card here? Right. And instead of just saying like, oh, I went to the birthday, right, which would be lying, you say, what are you talking about? Like, that's not a receipt for a birthday card. Right. And then you say,
and why are you looking at my stuff?
And why are you looking at my stuff? And if you say, well, but it says birthday card on here, they say, well, all cards are coded as birthday cards when you check out at the register, right? They say something that makes you doubt your own sense of reality. Because then you're like, well, maybe is that true? Are all greeting cards when you go to ring them up, do they just come up as birthday card? Like maybe that's true, right? So a lot of times the narcissist will say something that feels almost plausible. Again, it still feels off somehow, but it's plausible enough that you start doubting your own sense of reality. And that's what's really insidious, right? It's not just catching someone in a lie and feeling shitty because someone you cared about lied to you. That does feel shitty. But gaslighting is this additional layer of making you doubt your own sanity and doubt your own reality, which is much more damaging than just being hurt by being lied to, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So we used gaslighting a couple times in the last episode, and somebody pointed out to us that we didn't define it. So we just wanted to go through and give a good definition. But yeah, it's a really good movie. And
Yeah.
it was Angela
And the ending's good.
Lansbury's. The ending is good.
Yeah.
It was Angela Lansbury's first ever role. Angela Lansbury of Murder, She Wrote fame plays the housemaid. She was 18. It was her first ever film role. So random movie trivia. So yeah, if you actually want to understand gaslighting, go watch this movie. It's a great way to understand this particular type of emotional abuse.
And All About Eve. I think about that.
Yes, that is another good one. That is another good one.
We're gonna have to do like a separate
We're gonna have like a movie episode, because now I've got like 2 or 3 others in my head. I'm like, oh, and that one, and that one, and that one. Yeah, there's.
You know what we could do maybe is do some movie watches.
Oh, that would be fun. Yeah, like commentary.
Yeah.
Ooh, now
Like-
you're thinking.
Relatable content. Relatable content.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let's see. Do we want to talk a little bit about who this podcast is not for?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, if you have been diagnosed with a personality disorder, do not listen to this podcast. It would hurt, because this is really like, this is a place where, you know, we can let off steam and we can just be brutally honest, right? And part of it is because in society, we're not supposed to say these things, right? We're not supposed to be like, oh, you know, my parents abused me and they're narcissistic assholes and I want them to die or whatever. So it's like, this is a place where we've carved out. But so, you know, so, and I say this as a therapist, right? A therapist who's worked with people who have personality disorders, you know, lovingly, this is not for you, right? You deserve love and attention and a place where you can grow and you can kind of look at yourself and become a better person at your own pace. Don't do this in order to think, okay, I'm going to fast track and like figure some shit out. No, don't do that to yourself.
Yeah.
And don't do it to us either, right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think there are good places where people who've been diagnosed with personality disorders can get support. And this is not one of them. I will absolutely say this is not for everyone. And that's one of the groups. I'll also say that, you know, this podcast is for our tribe. This is for people who have the unfortunate experience of actually being able to understand what narcissistic abuse feels like. It's very different than other types of abuse. And so this podcast is absolutely for people who can resonate with what we're saying. If what we're saying turns you off, if what we're saying makes you feel like, oh my God, how can you talk about your own mother that way? Then this podcast is also not for you. I will say with the caveat that sometimes that is the first stage in actually recognizing that you've been through narcissistic abuse is denial, not just a river.
No, it isn't. Sorry, I couldn't help it.
So, you know, maybe if you have conflicted feelings about it, maybe that's something to look at. But if you absolutely are a person who has no life experience that could make you understand how you could ever stop talking to your mom, if your experience with your mom has been like loving and caring and wonderful, and maybe, sure, you didn't get along as teenagers, but, you know, then you got over it and we should get over it too, if that's sort of your attitude, this podcast is not for you. I will just say we all have different perspectives. We all have different experiences in life. And this is a very unique experience that I feel like it would be really hard to understand and to empathize with unless either you or someone you were very close to had been through this. So if you don't understand us and you sort of are finding yourself turned off by what we're saying, or even maybe a little morally outraged by what we're saying, then this podcast is also not for you. I'm sure there's a podcast about loving relationships between mothers and children, and that podcast is probably better for you.
And there's nothing I would love more than to live in a world where that's true, right? Where that's true, where no one has been hurt by their parents or their caregivers or their family members. Like, you know, that's my little girl's dream, right? Is to just be like, it's to also just not understand at all. You know, what are you talking about? You know, so
exactly.
I'd love that.
I always feel like this is one of those clubs where I don't want anyone to be a member of this club, but if you are, welcome. We have tea and
Yeah.
cookies and warm blankets, and we will be here and listen, like,
Yeah. Yeah.
so yeah.
Yeah. And we'll hate your parents for you.
Oh my God.
It's done.
One of my favorite things to do, I feel like this is a sport, actually. Like I feel like this is like I approach this like an elite athlete, is when I find out that someone I have become like relatively recent friends with has a parent who's a narcissist. And then at some point in the next preceding couple years, I get invited to some sort of family function. I absolutely love triggering the narcissist. It's like my favorite thing to do. I'm going to get so
Have
much
you ever
hate
done
for
that with my mom?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Give me some giggles.
I'm trying to remember specific incidences. With your mom, what I've done, so she'll say something that's completely not based in reality about either you or the family. She'll be like, you know, Elizabeth didn't come see us for a year because she's selfish and couldn't make the time, which, I know is not true, like factually not true, right? Or she'll
Yes.
say something about like, oh, so and so, we were going to invite them to this party, but then we decided not to because, they did something horrible or whatever. And I'm trying to remember specific things I've said. This is going to be so disappointing to you because I can't remember. But basically, I'll say something to her that like absolutely refutes those facts. Like I'll be like, well, wow, that's really funny because I was here last month and Elizabeth and I visited together and we were both
Right.
here. So I know that she's visited you in the last month.
Right.
And the thing that it'll do, it won't make her spin out, but it'll make her glitch, right? She'll have to
Yes.
just stop for a second and be like, recompute, recompute, recompute. And then, of
Yes.
course, she'll have some excuse. She'll be like, well, that didn't count because, yes, she was physically here, but she didn't even say hello to me or something, whatever, right? But
Right.
so with your mom, I'm more just sort of like, and this is what I do. I don't make people cry. I just make people glitch. I just make people glitch. I really like catching people, narcissistic people in their cruelty and just sort of being like, really?
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
So,
and I think that's one of the differences between a narcissist and a regular person, which is not everybody likes being told that they're wrong, right? But that if you're mistaken about something and someone corrects you, it's not necessarily triggering. You know what I mean?
right. Yes.
It's like, oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Or,
Right.
or I didn't think about it that way or something like that.
Yeah. Or I was going to say, or you get self-reflective, like you say, huh, interesting. That's not how I saw it. But I'm hearing you say that you had a different experience or you saw something that was a
Right.
different, let me go think about that, the defensiveness, the immediate defensiveness or the immediate sort of diversion to another thing that went wrong or another aspect of it that went wrong. I think is in particular a narcissistic trait.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about that as another form of gaslighting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember times when I would say something and there would be no response,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is, I think, another form of glitch, but it's also like this, like, we're just going to paper over, we're going to pretend that you didn't say that,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's like a whole other insidious level of gaslighting. I spent about 20 minutes in a car ride with my parents and my sister-in-law's mother. And by the end of the car ride, I was actually asking myself if I existed.
God.
And like, I was really like, am I here? Like,
Did you think you were having like a sixth sense moment or something? Is that?
No, it was as if I did not exist. Like, I would say things and like no response. I mean, it was as if I wasn't there.
Wow.
Unfortunately, it's not the only time I've had that experience, but
Yeah.
and I was in my mid 20s.
Yeah.
I mean, 20 minutes, mid 20s,
Yeah.
Okay.
That's crazy. I'm just thinking too, one of the things my mom used to do, so I would sometimes get the silence if I like presented her with like, facts, right?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say facts, no printer. Sometimes I would get the silence, but interestingly, sometimes what I'd get in response is, how can you be such a horrible person that you would say that to me?
Uh-huh.
I'm like, how can I be such a horrible person that I would like point out a fact to you?
Mm-hmm.
Like
Oh yeah.
you said that you know, have never given you a birthday card and I like hold up the birthday card I gave you last year and you tell me I'm being a horrible person. Like, what? That doesn't even compute. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, that one fortunately always just sort of made me laugh. It didn't, how do I explain this? It didn't sort of sink in the way that the silence or the gaslighting did because I was just like that. It just doesn't make sense what you're saying. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I did something nice and kind, right? And
right.
part of it is like you were well educated, you're a good writer, you're emotionally intelligent. How it could possibly you know, any thank you card. How is that not enough?
Do you
Right?
know that your mom didn't talk to me once for 2 years because the thank you card that I wrote her wasn't good enough?
Yes. It's funny because I have memories of her teaching me how to thank you card. So I get it. I get
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Because that's what's important, right?
Right. Not the sentiment or the effort. I mean, I will also say I don't think I was a child, but I was a teenager, or maybe in my early 20s. Like I was still, my brain was still forming, right? It wasn't like I was, I don't know. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
very,
You were practicing. But
yeah,
even so, I mean, come on.
I
If
know.
someone says thank you, it's like, oh, okay. Oh, that feels good.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. All right. Should we actually talk about our topic this week? As much as I've
Yes.
enjoyed swapping stories. So last week we talked about what is narcissism. This week we want to talk about what is trauma. Again, in these first couple episodes, we just want to sort of go over some of the basic terminology and what they mean, both from sort of a clinical point of view, but also from like a personal lived experience point of view.
Mhm.
So we want to talk about trauma and we want to talk about sort of the definition of trauma has changed a lot in the last, I would say, like 5 to 10 years, mostly the last 5 years. Can you talk a little bit about traditionally what you were taught was trauma, like when you went to school years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was taught was a traumatic event was an event where you or someone that you cared about was in danger of losing their life or being significantly injured. Like war and natural disasters and stuff like that. That's really sort of what I was taught.
Were you
So,
taught, I'm just curious, were you taught that that injury could also be an emotional injury, or was it only really a physical injury at the time?
well, I think it's interesting from the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, no. And I think it was really only much later in my therapy, and I think probably in the middle or late in my EMDR treatment. But, in my training, they were just starting to talk about complex trauma,
Hmm.
right? Just barely. So we regularly kind of think about a trauma as like a car accident or something like that. It's a discrete event, right? It's over. You survived, right? That can be traumatizing and create mental health issues, but it's over, right?
Right.
Complex trauma is, and part of it is that, which kind of, I guess, maybe points to a little bit about later definitions that you had been telling me about, is that, complex trauma is a peppering of sometimes big T traumas, right? Events,
Hmm.
but interspersed with like little T trauma events, right? And so what we're talking about here is, wait a minute, and someone explained something like it's the raindrop theory, right? Where it's like,
Mm.
well, one raindrop, okay, fine. Like, what's your problem? It's just
Yeah.
one raindrop. Like,
Right.
but 1,000 or 10,000 or whatever,
Yeah.
you're fucking drenched, right?
Yeah.
And it's like one of those things where it's like, well, let's just say, right? I spend 20 minutes in a car with my sister-in-law's mother, right? And I'm in my 20s, right? 20 minutes and I'm already like dazed, right? So
Mhm.
imagine growing up with this person,
Yeah.
day one,
Yeah.
day one ongoing,
Well,
right?
even
You're a child.
before day one, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about
Yes.
the in utero effects either in this episode or in another episode. But
Yeah.
yeah, day one, but even before day one. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the
That too.
raindrop thing makes me think of that saying like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Like one
Yes.
paper cut Yeah, it's painful and annoying. But you can function afterwards, right? Maybe for a day or two, you sort of notice it when you do certain activities, but you're there. But if you had 10 paper cuts, 100 paper
Yeah.
cuts, 500 paper
Mm-hmm.
cuts, 1,000 paper cuts, you wouldn't be able to function. It's the
Mm-hmm.
same small injury. It's just like the quantity over time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And it's especially true with the type of trauma that we're talking about because when you add in the development of the nervous system and
Mm-hmm.
all this stuff, like, yeah, I mean, the person who doesn't want to hear this podcast is just like, get over yourself. It's like, no, no,
Right.
no, no. You're a
Yeah.
grown up, right? You're grown up and you're just hearing about it, right?
Right. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about sort of get over it and why that doesn't work for, well, any kind of trauma, but especially complex trauma. And I want to talk a little bit about sort of the definition of complex trauma. So we talked about, traditional trauma is like one event, like a car accident or, someone dying or something, right? An event that happens and you go through it and it's traumatic and it leaves an impact. But complex trauma, the definition is trauma that occurs over the course of at least 1 year, right? So this has to be ongoing trauma where on a pretty much daily basis, you're experiencing some sort of trauma. And I'm going to defer to Gabor Mate's definition here, which I just read recently about trauma, which I just love because I think it's a good definition. I am paraphrasing here, so apologies to Dr. Mate if I am messing this up. But he says trauma is something that diminishes you physically, psychically, or spiritually. So I love the phrase here, diminishes you. Like you are less than you were before somehow after experiencing this trauma. And again, this could be for what we call a big T trauma, like one of those big events, right? If you were in a car accident, maybe you never walk the same way again, or you have back pain for the rest of your life, or you have flashbacks about the car accident when you hear, tires squealing or something, right? Absolutely can happen with big T trauma, but with little T trauma, that every day, just a few paper cuts type of trauma, I feel like that really does, in the immediate sense, diminish you psychically or spiritually. And by spiritually here, I just mean sort of like your joie de vivre, your will to live, your excitement about being here on this planet. That's sort of what I'm talking about when I talk about spiritually.
Yeah.
It absolutely diminishes you physically, but usually those effects don't come until decades later.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually what I do for a living as an energy healer is I work with people who are having physical illnesses that are in part because of the physical effects that happened from trauma in their childhoods.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. And again, I feel like this should be a whole other episode. I'm just going to give like a short example. So
there's so many things to talk about. So yeah, we'll just
so many things.
Whatever comes up. I respect you, Megan, and I know your expertise is deep and wide. And I can't wait to hear. I can't wait to make as much room for it as we can.
Thank you. Trying not to dissociate.
See, again, that's me love bombing. But the thing is that I don't fuck it up later, right? And I'm not lying.
Well, and it's based in you actually knowing me,
that's true.
Not you knowing me for a day.
It's not some fantasy, Megan.
Right. Exactly. So, I'll just give one example. So, for example, if you are experiencing, let's say, narcissistic trauma, starting in utero, which this is kind of crazy that it happens in utero, your nervous system does not develop in the same timeline or in the same way as someone who is not experiencing complex trauma. So, for example, your brain pulls development away from the part of your brain that creates short-term memories and puts development towards the part of your brain that is involved in fight or flight responses. Mm-hmm. So you come out of the womb primed to look for danger and being really, really good at it and probably being able to sense danger way better than most babies, right? Mm-hmm. So that's just one example. It also affects your immune system. It creates more inflammation. Inflammation is the root of a lot of diseases. So I will go into this in more detail, I'm sure, in a later episode. But when I say it diminishes you physically, psychically, or spiritually, the psychically, the sort of emotional part and the spiritual part are maybe more readily apparent. And maybe that's what you go to therapy for, originally. but the physical part is absolutely true. And it may just take longer to actually show up so that you don't quite understand that it's related to the trauma, because maybe it's like 3 decades after you left your childhood home, right? All of a
Mm-hmm.
sudden you have
Mm-hmm.
diabetes or arthritis or cancer, right? And you don't understand that this is actually a physical wound from the trauma that you
Mm-hmm.
experienced. But research is catching up with that and is starting to show that that is absolutely the case.
Hmm. So I have two things that I want to say about this. One thing is I love this. There's this seed of an idea in here in this definition, which is that anything that diminishes you. I love this very subtle, that the expectation that life is an environment where you grow, right? And you just become more and stronger and what, I don't know, whatever, like you flower or whatever, and
Yeah.
that is actually like natural,
Yeah.
and that anything that diminishes you, that's something that's suspect, right? I love that
Yeah.
because I was really taught in some ways that like life is about how much you can stand,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And again, like I am super privileged and all that stuff. And I know that that is actually true for many, many people. Society has chosen them, like you're going to shoulder the burden. But that is also what I was taught. It's not natural to grow,
Yeah.
unimpeded or,
And
you
I
know.
think, I think it's really important to distinguish between something that challenges you or even stresses you
Mm.
versus something that diminishes you, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, for example, when I talk about this, I'm going to use examples a lot from the natural world because we are animals, right? So things that affect the way that animals and other life forms operate is we have a lot of similarities. So, for example, when they tried to grow trees in a habitat, like an indoor habitat, and they gave them like sun lamps and they gave them, I mean, there might even been skylights. They gave them everything they need. They gave them nutrients, they gave them water, they gave them sunlight. And these trees would grow to a certain height and then they started falling over. Seemed perfectly healthy, and then one day would just fall over. And they couldn't figure out what it was for a while. And then when they eventually did, they realized that in this habitat, there was no wind. And
Oh,
that
wow.
trees actually need wind to blow them in order to like grip their roots in and grow those roots deeper so that they can really, really be stable. So that when
Wow.
they do grow to a certain height, they can carry their own weight, right?
Wow.
Otherwise, the trees would get to a certain height. They still had really shallow root systems because they'd never really been challenged by the wind. And when they got
Hmm.
to a certain height, they would just fall over, right? So I think
Hmm.
it's really important to distinguish between stress, like I would call the wind in that case like a stress on the tree that actually
Yeah.
helped the tree grow, right?
Hmm.
Versus
Yeah.
something that diminishes you. That wind, even a really bad windstorm, like maybe blew off some branches or some leaves or something, but the tree was still the tree afterwards. It could regrow those, right? It didn't feel
Hmm.
scared to regrow those branches afterwards, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Or if it was diminished, there would have been like a difference in how it grew and how it thrived afterwards,
Hmm.
right?
Sure.
So stresses are healthy in a lot of ways, actually. There's research on stress showing something even called challenge stress, which actually activates a whole other system than our regular stress system and is actually good for us. We need challenges. We need them in order to grow and in order to like figure out new solutions and find new ways and tap into our network of support and, like develop those relationships. Like we need those kind of challenge stresses, but they don't diminish us afterwards. And I think that's the key here when it comes to trauma.
Hmm. That's a really good reminder. It's a really good reminder. Something else I wanted to share. I was really excited about this. So I just started playing this video game, which is I think it's the first time I've ever done. It's like an arena game where it's like you've got fighters and that's like turn based. So it's like, you do an attack and then the other person does an attack. And because I don't know all the attacks, right? I don't know all the fighters and I don't know all the attacks. So one of my guys gets attacked and I lose some of my life points, right? It's like,
Mhm.
right. And then I'm like, oh, okay. All right. So I do another turn and then it comes back and then it happens again, right? It's like this timed thing where it's like my fighter gets damaged over and over again over time, just with this like one lob, right?
Hmm.
Like you gradually just lose life force no matter what. And, you can end up losing your fighter. And I really, to me, it was like, that's kind of like what trauma is like, even single event, right? Which is
Hmm.
like, you have the trauma and you're like, oh, fuck, right? And whatever, I feel terrible, blah, 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 blah. And then life goes on, right? And then, like, all of a sudden, it hits again because there's these residual effects from the original painful experience. And that you go through life and, like, every now and then, or maybe a lot of the time, you get that, like, zzz
Hmm.
again. And it just happens over and over again if it's not treated,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. And so
absolutely.
if you think about complex trauma as like a bunch of these attacks lobbed at you and that they'll just go off, right?
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Boom,
Hmm.
boom, boom, as you're going through your day to day life. And it can get really, really hard.
Yeah.
So,
And you start being hyper aware of when's the next attack coming,
yeah,
even in a
yeah,
time when you're not being attacked. You're still on the lookout, you
yeah,
know?
yeah.
Let's talk a little bit more. Let's go back to talking about trauma. So, how do you know if you've had trauma? I think that's a big question for people who've been through narcissistic abuse because the trauma isn't like what we think of as child abuse. It's not someone hitting you, right? It's not someone, going out and getting drunk, right? And then coming home in a rage, right? Like those kind of things I think are a little easier to point to in a way and be like, that was abuse, right? How do you know that you've had traumatic abuse as a child when it's this type of abuse?
Hmm. Well, I know for me, I startle very easily.
Hmm.
So, like, if I hear a loud noise or someone comes through the door very quickly or whatever, it's like I have a startle response. And then also, this is something that I've been working in therapy, which is even sometimes with people that I trust, right? Like my inner circle, there's this level of physical relax that doesn't happen unless I am completely alone.
Hmm.
That's
Yeah.
not about them at all.
Right.
It really isn't. It's really, really early trauma,
Hmm.
which is like, I am not fucking safe here. People are not safe.
Yeah.
Cannot relax unless I know I'm not going to be hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's true. So, an easy startle response, being hyper aware of your environment. I know that I had an experience a couple weeks ago where I was sitting in a doctor's office, and it was one of those offices where there's like multiple treatment rooms along this hallway. And I would hear people walk by. I mean, it was just the doctors or the nurses or whoever just going about their business, walking up and down the hallway. But I found myself bracing every time I heard those footsteps come near my door of, are they coming into my room? They weren't
Mm-hmm.
going to do me any harm. I was voluntarily at this there's an acupuncture office. Like I was voluntarily there to get a treatment that I know helps me, right? I trust my practitioner there. I trust the woman who runs the front desks seems very lovely, right? And yet, somewhere in my body is still this very automatic and unconscious response that when
Yeah.
I hear footsteps coming towards my doorway, I better brace because you never know what's coming, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I
Yeah.
think being an easily startled or being hyper aware of your environment in one way or another. I live in an apartment complex and I happen to live in a unit that's near the front door to the building. So I can hear anytime anyone walks up to walk into the building. And it doesn't matter what I'm doing, only when I'm in one room of the apartment, but it doesn't matter what I'm doing. If I hear that, I stop whatever I'm doing, I freeze, I get very still, and I listen to see who's coming in.
Mm-hmm.
These aren't people that are coming to my apartment. These are probably people who live here or maybe like the postal carrier, right? But it's still this very unconscious and very automatic switch into fight or flight. In this case, freeze, actually, switch into
Mm-hmm.
freeze that I don't even know I'm doing until it's already done. And then I'm
Mm.
like, wait, what am I doing? Those are just two
Yeah.
dudes that live on the second floor. I know them, I can hear them,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah. So I think that sort of hypervigilance is one sign.
I want to add something about freeze because sometimes emotionally, I feel like it's more resonant to call it playing dead, which
Mm-hmm,
is if you're an animal, right, and there's this predator or whatever, and like you can calculate, right? I can't fight. I'm not going to be able to fight and win, and I'm not going to be able to get away.
mm-hmm.
I'm going to play dead, and
Yeah,
maybe they'll go away.
yeah. For me, the way I recognize that I've gone into freeze is I am completely still, like completely still, like I'm not even blinking, like completely
Yeah.
still. And I realize that I haven't taken a breath in a good amount of
Yeah.
time, like
Yeah.
everything stops, including my blinking and my breathing. That to me is sort of the sign that I've gone into a freeze response. So yeah, playing dead to the point where you even stop the animal's ability to see that you're breathing, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
sure if I could stop my heart at those moments, I would, right? Like stop all signs of life, right?
Yeah.
Is the freeze response. I would also say that a really good sort of litmus test, if you've had this kind of trauma, is that you most likely have some sort of attachment wounding, I'll say,
Okay.
where it makes it so that, I mean, I would think probably the most common one is thinking that people are mad at you, or thinking that people are going to be mad at you, or thinking that people are going to leave you, somehow thinking that somebody's going to turn on you suddenly, right?
Yeah.
And this can look like a lot of things. This can look different depending on whether it's a romantic partner or like your boss at work or your friends. Like, it can look different. But almost everyone I know who's been through this kind of abuse has this, and this dovetails into what you said about not being able to feel fully relaxed unless you're alone. There is somehow a hyper awareness around all people and what they're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I guess the way you said it is sort of accurate. Like people aren't safe. Even people that have never harmed you a day in their life, right? That are the kindest, sweetest people.
Yeah.
And for me, I know this is why I feel like I've always had pets. I have no fear that my pet is going to gaslight me. It's like really the only creature that I don't fear is going to somehow turn on me at some point, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's another sign that you've had trauma, that you've had this type of narcissistic trauma. I would say another one is we talked about the freeze response, but the fawn response,
Mhm.
or the appease response, which is actually a learned behavior. It's not as much. We talked about, like when I talked about the freeze response, I talked about it happening and I didn't even know it was happening. Like it's a very
Mhm.
autonomic, we call them autonomic responses, right? The fawn response, I think, is interesting because people didn't even know it exists until they started studying trauma in women, which, didn't happen until like 10 or 15 years ago, because why study women? And the fawn response is where I'll give the example that I think probably every woman out there can recognize. You are in a bar or at a party or somewhere like that, and a guy comes up to you, and you just get the creepy ick vibe from him. And he is like, "Hey, how are you? You look like an angel. You're amazing. What's your number? You're so hot." Like, whatever, right? Whatever the weird, cheesy pickup line is, or just intrusive. And you get the ick. And when you try to give them, and so when we get the ick like that, when we feel like someone's dangerous, we should turn around and tell them, "Hey, dude, fuck off.
Mhm.
I'm not interested
Yeah.
in talking to you. Go somewhere else." Right.
Yeah.
However, as women, we know that that can be dangerous, right?
Yeah.
Because men can be violent. You never know who you're talking to, right? You never know what their response is going to be. If that wounds their masculinity, they could get very defensive in a scary way, right?
Yeah.
So instead, what you do is you say, "Oh, thank you. You're so sweet. But I have a boyfriend. He's right over there coming back from the bathroom in just a minute," right? And let's say you don't have a boyfriend, right? Like you lie. You lie and you are nice to this person in order to gently diffuse the situation, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so fawning or appeasing is that survival strategy that if you don't know if the person you're talking to is about to get dangerous, which is very common when you're dealing with a narcissist, you do not know if they're about to get dangerous. You never know when
Yeah.
that will be triggered. That instead of saying, screw off, fuck you, you say, oh, like, that's funny that you said that. Ha ha ha. I'm going to go over here now. Okay. Right. Or whatever. Right.
Yeah.
So it's something, again, that is developed very early, probably before you even were aware of it. So this is probably developed pre-verbally. So when you're 1, 0 to 1 or 2, and it's something that you do so early and so often that it literally does become second nature. You don't even know you're doing it. It's just the way you operate. It's just part of your personality at that point, right?
Yeah.
So if that's something you often see in yourself as well, that could be signs that you've been through this kind of trauma.
I'm thinking about it as like these little like emotional cookies that you just hand out. You're just like, here's a little like a feeling good cookie. And I'm just gonna like spread them around. And then that just like it smooths everything out. You know what I mean? And
yeah. And what it is you're just constantly trying to avoid any kind of conflict.
Yeah.
And it probably worked really well when you were a kid. You probably did. You're probably great at it. You're probably great at making people feel good.
Are you trying to make me feel good about making people feel good?
Well, and me too. Like, like
I do it. I obviously, I mean, you can hear me do it all the time.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Me too. I mean, there's a reason we are both in caring professions, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's that old joke. Did you grow up in a narcissistic household? How's that caring profession going?
Totally. Yeah. What is it? Eric says, he talks about they roll their own, right?
What does that mean?
It's like rolling your own cigarettes. It's like you made your own at home.
Oh.
Right? So it's like the narcissists made their own caring professional at home.
Yes. Oh my God, I've never heard of that. But yeah, absolutely. If you
won't buy it from the store.
Hey, just have your daughter take care of you emotionally, or your son. Absolutely. Oh my God, I've never heard that, but yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
I do want to point out that one of the things that's so beautiful about the sort of more contemporary versions of trauma versus the definition of trauma that I learned is this very like patriarchal, subtle thing about the original, which is that one, it's about the event, right? And it is an objective. It's kind of like all you need to do is hear about the event, and then you can decide for yourself if it is trauma worthy or not. And I know that like they used to just be like, well, not everybody gets traumatized the same, or that not everybody experiences these events as traumatic. But that's really like this tag on. But what it really is like, it's not about you, right? And it's not over time. Right. Because I love that about your definition, which is it's really like looking back. It's like, Jesus, like what could my life have been like? Or, but it really is all about like that objective thing, right? That someone else can decide, oh, you weren't really traumatized. How
right.
That
doesn't sound that bad. Right. Exactly. And I think, well, two things that makes me think of is one, this new definition of trauma absolutely puts the concentration of what we're looking at on the person's response to what happened, not the event itself. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and I always say to my clients, like, this isn't the trauma Olympics, right? Like, sure, you can go to that place of like, other people have it worse than me, but there's really no such thing as the trauma Olympics, because it's not about the events that are happening. It's about people's responses to them. And somebody could be going through something that objectively looks really horrible, but if they have a super sound support system, like a family that's loving, and they probably won't be as traumatized, right?
Yeah.
It's not helpful just to look at the event. You have to look at the entire context of the person and their environment and the people around them and the other things that they have in their life. Like, are they doing this in the middle of poverty? Are they doing this in the middle of a war zone? Those are going to affect things as well, right? So you have to look not just at the event, but also at the person and at the environmental context as well. So, yeah.
I think there's also something really profound about trusting yourself, because like, even though I've done so much trauma work, I'm sort of in the middle of getting a whole nother layer in. And what I found is that like, if I'm feeling something and then I'm really able to pay attention, I get two things. I get the emotion, like the actual emotion. And then I also get a sense about how old I feel, like what age, right? Like sometimes it's like, oh, I feel like I'm 5.
Yeah.
right? And I don't have to know the story. And that's important because a lot of times the effects of trauma, it's like they come in pieces,
Mhm.
right? So you might not know the story. But for me, it's been so validating to take these two pieces of information together. It's like, okay, so I know like what's coming up for me is terror or despair, right? And it's like, and I feel five.
Yeah.
What 5-year-old child should be experiencing terror or despair?
Yeah.
And then it doesn't matter. It
It
doesn't
doesn't
matter
matter.
what happened.
Well, and again, if we're looking at the science on the physiology of this, like our short-term memory is impaired when we're going through long-term complex trauma. Our brains intentionally don't remember the specifics because they're too painful, right? But
You're right.
your
You're
limbic
right.
system, the emotional part of your brain that codes experiences is
Yeah.
absolutely online, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
you literally may never have encoded the actual memory, but you may have encoded the emotional experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 That reminds me of something else, which is, and I didn't really find it when I was kind of looking at the trauma symptoms necessarily, but it is there, which is a sense of what's called foreshortened future, which is
Mm,
if you ever talk to someone and they're like, yeah, I never really thought I'd make it past 30,
yeah,
or like, I don't have a life plan for myself. Like, oh, like, yeah, I guess I'll graduate high school, but,
yeah,
it's really like there is, you're so, all of your resources are going into surviving the moment that
yes,
it's like there's this blankness. That is a sign
yeah.
of trauma.
That's so funny. I've always, whenever somebody's like, what are your 5, 10, and 15-year goals? Like I literally draw a blank. I'm like, like I'm like, still be able to afford groceries? Like, like, it always goes back to those super basic things. Like I'm not able to think outside of just survival when it comes to long-term plans. You know, Another sign that you might have gone through trauma is actually that you're really good at pushing through uncomfortable emotions or uncomfortable situations. And it makes
Yeah.
it seem like you have your shit together, like way better than anyone else. Like you look like this superhuman person almost. You're incredibly organized, you're incredibly efficient. Finished your graduate degree in 1 year when it takes most people 2.5, right? Like those can
Yeah.
actually be signs of this kind of trauma because in my opinion, it is a form of the freeze response and that it's a form of staying invisible. If I don't do
Mm-hmm.
anything wrong, if I am perfect all the time and in fact exceed expectations, then
Mm-hmm.
nobody's going to have something that they can like take the corkscrew and like dig into me about, right? And
Mm-hmm.
maybe
Yeah.
I'll even get some praise, perhaps, if I'm really
Maybe.
good, right? But at the baseline, at least there's nothing they can call me out on, right? There's nothing they can find to dig at, right?
Yeah. And I
Mm.
can see how that's flight too, right? Which is
Yeah.
if I run fast enough and hard enough, no one's going to catch up to me
Hmm.
and I'll just be the best and no one's going to be
Hmm.
able to, you know, yeah. I also get what you're saying, which is like if I do everything perfectly, then, they're just will be passed by. And
Yep.
I also get that sense of like movement, right? I got to keep
Hmm.
moving.
Got to
I got
keep
to keep
going.
going. I got to
Yeah.
keep doing,
Hmm.
you know.
Yeah. So that can also be a sign, and that's a really hard one because you appear outwardly incredibly functional and
Mm-hmm.
incredibly successful and
Mm-hmm.
incredibly put together. And you feel that way on the inside to some extent too. You're like, look at what I've done. I've done all these things, and da, 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 right? But
Mm-hmm.
there is this sense that exactly what you said, that if I slow down or if I stop or if I go backwards or if I aren't accelerating, faster and faster or at the same rate I have, that it's like
Yeah.
something's going to catch up with me. Something's going
Yeah.
to catch up with me. Got to keep
Yeah.
going. Got to keep going. So outwardly, you look incredibly successful, but inwardly, you feel like you're on a hamster wheel and you don't know how to get off.
Yeah. Yeah. And there can be something exhilarating about it. It's familiar and it can be exhilarating, you
Well,
know.
that gets into like emotional addiction, like getting addiction to those chemicals and all of that, which again, we could get into like that whole thing in another episode, but we absolutely get, I don't know that I love the word addicted, but acclimated to a certain level of different chemicals going on in our body and our brain. And if that certain level of chemicals is like high adrenaline and cortisol, and that's what we grew up with, and we've only known that way, our bodies love to keep things the way they are, even if the way they are isn't really great for us. Homeostasis is the term for like trying to get back to whatever the last state was.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about this idea of like, well, doesn't everyone have trauma? You know,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
yes. I think that's my answer. Yes. Like, it's impossible to go through a human life without having something traumatic happen. Like, people die and
Yeah.
bad things happen. Car accidents happen. You know, pets die, right?
Yeah.
People get sick. So, yes, I think the short answer is yes. But again, I think the important thing to look at is what is the context of that, your personal context? Did you have support while you were going through that?
Yeah.
Were you listened to?
Yeah.
Were you validated? Did you have people there to help you understand your experience? Or did you have people there that gaslit you and made you feel like your experience was invalid and sort of left you all by yourself to figure it out and sort of told you to push through, right?
It's not an all trauma, but what I find a really valuable concept is the concept of the moral injury. So I don't think every trauma has it, but a moral injury is when you're in a situation where, in order to survive, you have to violate one of your own values. It's like a form of self-betrayal in the service of your own survival. And, oftentimes that's what, people who come back from war, like what they talk about is this just, I had to do terrible things, but even, because to kind of go back to what we're talking about in terms of development and whatever, which is that if you are a small child, right, and maybe something very small, like a lie or hiding something, or, you know what I mean? Something, it can be something that seems small in the scheme of things to a grown-up, but it can absolutely be a form of betrayal of yourself that really leaves some lasting scars.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that even small children know the difference between, like, kids lie to get away from things. Like, did you take that candy? No. I think there's a difference between that kind of lie. I remember when I was little, the difference between that kind of lie, because I absolutely did that. Every kid does, right? Versus the kind of lie I was telling where I knew my safety was at stake.
Yeah.
Even very, very young, I emotionally felt that there was a distinct difference in how I felt in those kind of lies. The stealing the candy lie felt maybe like a little bit of guilt or a little bit of shame. The I'm lying to keep myself safe felt like terror.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, and there's also something very good about allowing yourself to look messy and, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. That is a challenge. At least
I know.
Here.
Okay, so we want to end our episodes with what we call the mini crazy mom off, where we each tell a story about something crazy our moms did, and we decide who wins for the week. I think we decided that we were going to start with some relatively tame stories, just so that we don't scare people off too early.
Yeah. Or scare ourselves. I mean, I don't have a therapy appointment until Tuesday.
Yes, so yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. I have a client right after this.
There's only so many boxes I can undone.
I know, that's true. And then after that, we're going to share some tools we use this week to help with our anxiety or CPTSD, our hypervigilance, all the things that tend to come up. So do you have a story? Do you want to go first? I have a story that I've thought of that's relatively mild.
I'll go first. And again, I've totally minimized it. Okay, so I must have been like 9th or 10th grade. And my mom was opening up a store, which, well, not really. I mean, anyway. there
like
was
a
like a
boutique or something?
sort of, but it was like in the home. It was one of those things where it's like you go to like one of those gift things where it's like you go to someone's house and like they have all
Oh,
sorts of
like a
stuff.
Tupperware party type of thing, but like with other
Sort of.
things. Okay.
Sort of.
Okay.
So of course, but my mom was like, I'm opening up a store, you know. So anyway, and she had me design an ad for her. And I did it. And my best friend in high school was in the newspaper. Not the school newspaper. And my mom wanted to buy an ad in the newspaper and whatever. And something happened. And again, so ninth or 10th grade, something happened. And I don't know if the ad got lost or if it just didn't run or something like that.
I was going to say, I already know where the story is going. I've never heard it, but I already know where it's going.
Okay. So, yeah, you can just see it all. And my mom lost her fucking mind
Yep.
on my behalf. Okay. Like, you know, she's just, you know, like your friend is disrespecting you and this is not right, whatever. She called my friend and chewed her out so badly. I mean, made her cry. And I had to hear this, like because she was doing it for me,
Right.
which is just it's just fucked up.
Well,
And so
you and she are the same person in her mind, but go ahead.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Ugh. And no, like I'm a little homunculus, right? Like some little deformed homunculus. And the thing about it is that not only did I feel terrible about it, but actually, like years later in my 20s, my friend said to me, you know, I still have nightmares about your mom.
Oh no.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you
Oh my
imagine?
God. Can we send her some chocolate or some flowers or a hug or something?
I know. I know. And one
I
conversation.
know. Yeah. Well, that was the other thing I was thinking is that that must have been in some weird way kind of validating that only after having one conversation with your mom, she was that affected and you had to deal with years and years of it on a daily basis.
You know, it's so funny. I didn't even get there because I feel so terrible about just a little bit of what my friend shared with me. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? But I mean, I guess it's validating, but boy, would I rather be wrong.
Right. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Or, you know, or manage the impact, right?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, right? Which is like, all right, I will throw myself on this grenade as long as other people are safe. Other people can get away.
Yeah. 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 Oh, Jesus. I'm so sorry.
But of course, I should forgive her. And of course, I should talk to her. And what is wrong with me? I am a terrible daughter.
You're a terrible daughter.
What?
You're a terrible daughter. She was
I
just
am a,
doing it to protect you. How can you not? The fact that you're anything other than grateful for that shows something about your character, Elizabeth.
well, and there's a moral injury in there, right? I didn't do it, but it
Right.
was like this, right? Gaslighting, hooking into a moral injury. This
Yep.
is you.
Yeah.
I'm doing this to help you and save you from this horrible person.
Right. Right. Oh my God. The number of times narcissists will do something horribly emotionally injurious and claim it's for your benefit.
Oh, yeah.
It's
Oh,
horrible.
yeah. Hmm. Okay. I'm ready. I'm
Oh, are you ready for mine? Okay. So when I was growing up, my mom was like sort of a socialite, or at least she was a wannabe socialite. Like she really loved sort of knowing who was who and like the intellectual and artistic community in Los Angeles. And she would have these very, very elaborate dinner parties, like multi-course dinner parties. She was also an amazing chef. She would cook everything herself. It was delicious. She was a phenomenal cook. And so the way that these dinner parties would always run is that she would have people arrive at like, I don't know, 6 or 6:30 and usher them into the living room, which is this room that like we never used. It was only for guests. So it had the nice furniture in it and the nice paintings and everything. And everyone would have cocktails, and sort of there would be like a little cocktail mixer would happen before the dinner party. And then at a certain point, people would move into the living room and all sit down and have dinner together. And I was never allowed to actually attend any of these dinner parties. I was there to bring, so when people were in the cocktail party portion in the living room, there were always appetizers that she'd made. And so she would give me like a tray to like carry the appetizers around and like serve people. And then when it came down to the dinner, I would go into the kitchen and I would get a plate of food, and I would have to go up to my room. So I could hear the dinner party happening downstairs, but I was never invited. I was upstairs. So essentially, I was treated like hired help.
Did she give you a uniform?
I mean, she probably would have if she thought she could get away with it.
Absolutely.
So at a certain point, and this started when I was very young, I mean, probably like 5 or 6. And it was, oh my God, Megan's so cute. Look at this little 5-year-old with a tray of canapes. That's sort of how it started when I was 5, but it continued all the way through when I moved out. And at a certain point, I started playing the harp as a musical instrument. And the harp was located in this fancy living room. It was the only place in the house that a giant freaking harp would fit, to be honest. So the harp was in there. So I would go in there to practice whatnot. And at some point, she decided that in addition to serving the canapes and helping with all of that, that I should be the musical entertainment for these evenings. So she would assign me pieces to play, like play, whatever, this Bach piece, or play this, she wanted a specific piece, and I would have to learn it. And then I would have to play this series of pieces during the cocktail party portion of the thing. And again, it was like, people were like, oh my gosh, Megan's so good. I was very good at this instrument. Megan's so amazing at the harp, like how amazing. And so at one point I got fed up with all of this. And so the way I decided to rebel was that instead of playing the classical music that she requested, I figured out how to play soap opera themes and heavy metal songs on the harp. And so one night she was expecting, whatever concerto, and I played the Young and the Restless theme, the General Hospital theme, the One Life to Live theme, and then Sweet Child O' Mine. And then I think something by Metallica might have been the last one.
Yeah.
And this went on at first. Nobody other than my mother ever noticed anything, to be honest. But at first, nobody noticed anything. And then at one point, I could see from across the room when my mom saw what I was doing, when she realized what I was doing. Like, she must have recognized one of the soap opera themes. And
not that she would necessarily admit it, because she was too highbrow.
She was too highbrow, right?
Yeah.
She turned around and stared at me with daggers in her eyes like I have never seen before. I mean, she was furious. And later, of course, I got screamed at about how I'd humiliated her in front of all of her very important friends by playing soap opera music.
Right.
Soap opera music.
Right. Which no one noticed. On the harp at a cocktail party that I couldn't even attend or eat the food at. Years later, actually, I was talking to someone who was a professional musician, and they were like, how old were you? And I was like, I don't know, like 14, 15. And they were like, at 15, you were figuring out how to arrange pieces for the harp that weren't meant for the harp. And I was That's
like,
where I was going.
Yeah. And they were like, that's actually incredibly impressive. Like, if you'd had healthy parents, they would have been like, holy shit, like, you figured out how to adapt that arrangement for the harp. Like, that's phenomenal. Yeah. Like, I didn't have the sheet music or anything. It was all by man. I didn't have the sheet music for soap opera or for Sweet Child of Mine, for that matter. Like, it was from memory and figuring it out. Right. So they were like, that's actually incredibly impressive. Like, they should have lauded you for your musical talent. Yeah. But anyway.
And I've seen those daggers. I've seen those daggers on your mom.
They're intense.
I don't even have words for it, but like, yeah.
I will say in this instance, like I knew I was setting myself up to get yelled at. Like I knew I was going to get it. I knew I was going to get it. And so it wasn't as bad because like I knew that I pushed her buttons intentionally. But yeah, still just the whole thing that I was essentially hired serving help and entertainment help for my own mother for from 5 to 18. So what is that?
Wow.
13 years every time she had a cocktail party. And I would get yelled at if I came down during the dinner party. Like if I got thirsty and came down for like a glass of water and she was in the kitchen, she was like, "What are you doing here? Go back to your room." Sorry, I'm thirsty. You
Wow.
have a faucet in your bathroom. It's like, okay.
There's a well 5 miles down, 5 miles away. Can't you go there?
Crawl out of your window and go to the neighbor's house. What's wrong with you?
Here, take this thing out of the oven. Don't use mitts. How
What are
dare
you, a
you?
princess? Yes. I still can remember like very, very vividly the sensation of playing. Oh God, I don't know what this. I think it's Young and the Restless. Do 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 do.
Oh, maybe.
Anyway, I remember doing.
all
I
my.
can remember doing that
No,
on the
I watched
harp.
Days of Our Lives. I watched Days of Our Lives, but
I
that's
did
it.
too, but I don't remember the theme for that one. I think you win this week. My God, like the fact that
Oh,
your
no.
story involves the traumatizing of another human being in addition to you, like I'm sorry, I got to give you this one. Like that's
Thank you.
horrible.
I know you've got worse ones for your mom.
Well, I
have
mean,
to
that's the
say.
point is every week we bring a story and we just sort of see who it is. And this week, it's all yours.
Thank you. What do I get?
My undying love and admiration. The fact that I'm proud of you and holy shit, how did you escape that? And
Oh,
I'm
thank you.
amazed that you're as functional and wonderful and compassionate as you are. All right, so let's talk about some tools we used this week to get through a difficult situation. I will talk about one I used. So, as part of my work as an occupational therapist in the school district, we have IEP meetings, which are meetings we talk about. Every child who's in special education has what's called an individualized education plan or an IEP. And every year you have meetings, and most of the time they're lovely. It's the teachers and the parents and the special ed providers, and we all get together and we talk about what progress we've made and what goals we have for next year. But every now and again, you have a parent who invites either an educational advocate or a lawyer to the meeting. And sometimes that's fine, but oftentimes as a service provider, I end up feeling like I'm being cross-examined and like somehow I'm doing like not doing a good enough job or whatever. I've been in a bunch of these meetings and I get it. It's the lawyer or the advocate's job to like fight to get this child more services. And so they have to sort of like prove their point that the services that they're getting now don't seem adequate or whatever. It's a political thing. But I get very triggered by this because in my mind, if someone starts questioning you or going after you, they're not going to stop until you are crying on the floor and cannot move. Right. Because that was my experience with my mom is that if she started attacking me, I mean, I would get to the point where I mean, it would just go on for hours and I would at some point fall down on the floor in tears and just kind of wish I was dead. Right. Like, please make this stop. If you kill me right now, I'll be okay with it because I just want this to stop. Not that I believed in God, but whoever I believed in. And so I still have that in my system that if somebody starts going after me, it's going to be really, really bad to the point where I'm going to wish I was dead. And so what happened was we had this meeting and there was a surprise advocate. This is always like parents will often not tell us that this person is coming. And so it'll be a surprise. So we're not really prepared. Or as prepared, maybe. And so what happened was we had this meeting. There was an advocate there. We didn't know the advocate was coming. And I felt myself starting to get triggered. I was immediately like opening old evaluations, reading through them. What were the test results from 3 years ago, from 6 years ago, right? Like just really making sure I was up to date on everything I could possibly think of for this child so that no question could catch me off guard.
Mm-hmm.
Which I recognized pretty quickly was a trauma response, right? Because there's no way I should normally have to have that level of preparation for these meetings. That's not to be expected of providers in these meetings. And fortunately, somebody who was required by law to be at that meeting. We have to have an administrator at the meeting, and they were not there and they didn't show up. So about 15 minutes into the meeting, we hadn't started it yet, but we called it. We just said, okay, we're going to have to reconvene because legally this person has to be here and they're not. And I, of course, felt a huge wave of relief that I didn't have to do this, but I still felt myself triggered. And it was that feeling you were talking about before, where it was like everything was very fast, right? My thinking was fast. I'd been for the last 10 minutes while I'd been waiting for this person to arrive, like looking at the old IUPs, looking at the old documents, looking at my old clinical SOAP notes, like looking at it was very, very fast. So I recognized I was in this super speedy, triggered state. So we got off the meeting and I took a deep breath. And I did some self-talk and I immediately texted one of the other special ed members on the team. And I just checked in. I just had a human connection. I was just like, oh my God, I wasn't expecting that person to be there. Were you? And they said, no. I said, oh, okay. I just had a human connection. I just sort of like created some of that, like with somebody else who'd just been through the same traumatic thing that I did. Like I just had a connection with them and sort of there wasn't anything deep about the conversation. It was just a check-in, like, guess we're going to have to reschedule. But even that level of human connection with another person, I felt like calmed my nervous system. So I reached out to my support system, and different support systems for different environments. This isn't even someone I'm particularly close to, but it was enough. It was enough just to feel like I wasn't alone and I wasn't crazy, right? That somebody else had been through this too and had an experience of that reality that matched my experience of the reality. I think that was the important thing.
That's the thing about, if you've survived trauma, the big things are easy and the little things are so hard.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I actually was going to say the same thing, that I actually realized that I was dealing with some emotional stuff and that I was just going to push through. And then I was like, no, this person said that I could call them. I'm going to call them. Am I doing this? I'm actually doing it. So I did.
Yeah. Good. Good.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the techniques, that narcissists do is triangulation and isolation, right? Getting you separated from other people. So even just the simple act of connecting with another person can really just immediately take down that triggered response.
Yeah. Yeah. Contrary action, I hear in recovery circles. I'm just going to take contrary action.
Yes, absolutely. I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. All right. So I feel like that's enough trauma for today.
Yeah. No, I could get it. I could have a little more trauma.
So thank you, everyone, for listening and for sticking with us through this episode. I know it was a hard one. So please, if anything we said made you feel elevated, or if you're having the feels, take some time after listening to this to do something to help your nervous system reset and feel grounded and feel safe and connected. We love you. We don't know you, but we love you. And as usual, you should absolutely listen to your mom. Be a terrible, horrible daughter and just own it. Be the villain.
Yeah. Be the villain.
Be the villain. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. We'd be so grateful if you'd follow or subscribe and rate and review our new podcast on your favorite podcast app. Make sure to share it with friends, family, or anyone that you think may benefit from this content. And as a final reminder, you are not the crazy one.